You are watching and listening to the We Are West Ham podcast. I am Will Pugh, and we are here with an international break special. I know you're used to me and James putting our feet up for a couple of weeks whenever England head off into the sunset or to wherever it is they're playing against Andorra this week. But we thought, or I thought, as we sort of teed up on the podcast last week, that we'd get a special guest on. Just to give you something to watch and listen to while you're ignoring what's going on the international stage. And West Ham are actually the main club story across lots of the media, given everything that's going on, particularly with the fan board issuing that letter of no confidence in the board and the general feeling of negativity and malaise, despite that win at Nottingham Forest. And one man who has been at the centre of a lot of that discourse in the last couple of weeks is George Sims from The Observer. George, thanks so much for joining us. Brilliant to have you on the podcast. You wrote a fantastic article that got extremely well received and well shared by West Ham fans of all persuasions, really. And I think that's what was so interesting about it, why we were so keen to have a chat with you, is that West Ham fans over the last few years, as a passionate group of people and a passionate part of society, as most of us come from, they've been fairly divided over several issues. David Moyes being the predominant one. I'm sort of generally like kind of the poster boy, much to many people's furies of the David Moyes fan club. The article you wrote in The Observer came after the Chelsea game, so worth noting, before the glorious win at Nottingham Forest, of course. Moyes ball implemented to perfection by Graham Potter. The subdeck, the subheadline, if people don't know what that is, on your piece: erratic vision, awful transfers, and general apathy comes from higher up than the manager. The crux of the piece was effectively, analysis of what Graham Potter's doing, an acknowledgement that it isn't particularly, ripping up many trees. However, you then pointed the finger, which lots of people, in the media are sometimes reticent to do, at David Sullivan and those higher up at West Ham for the general malaise. It was very well received. How did you feel? What made you write the article? Where did this sort of urge come to put the piece out there?
Well, I think West Ham have been a really interesting club for a while, just because you sort of just noticed them. So I'm not a West Ham fan, so I'm coming at this as an outsider, but you just sort of see them. Well,
that was question 2, actually.
Yeah, sorry. Sort of seen them just sliding down gradually, and as I sort of say towards the end of the piece, like, just staying still in the Premier League doesn't work anymore, and it's felt like for a while what West Ham have been doing, just not really moving anywhere. And so I wanted to go and look at why that was. So I spent sort of week ahead of that Chelsea game looking into it all, speaking to people, and then went to the Chelsea game and got to watch that sort of absolute fiasco, really. I mean, I don't know if you were there, but yeah, people leaving by about half an hour through. It was really quite grim to watch all around.
I was quite proud of myself for staying to 77 minutes. I thought I'd done the players quite a service there. One of the lines you wrote in the piece was, "What's the point of West Ham in 2025?" And I think my anger and my disappointment or feelings of apathy, which is, you obviously clocked onto that, and exactly what most West Ham fans are feeling. It's either anger or apathy. There's nothing else among the West Ham fan base at the moment. And I think from my point of view, it's what's the point? The target, the goal of the club seems to be little more than to just exist, stay in the Premier League. But if West Ham are still around at the end of the season and they're still in the Premier League, whether they've come 16th or 11th, the sense seems to be, although the board naturally, or David Sullivan in particular, would like the club to get into Europe again and finish in the European places, it's that he might like that to happen, but fans can't really see a coherent plan of that being put into place. Is that something that you sort of picked up on, and how did you you've written such a well thought out piece. I'm surprised to hear you're not a West Ham fan, because it seemed to latch onto so many of the things that fans actually feel, and that not many other people sort of in the media industry particularly particularly look at that much?
No, I tried to speak to fans and people connected to the club to try and get a sense of that. But yeah, more than anything, it's sort of a thing that a lot of clubs that are going wrong, there are similarities throughout, and you see similar things in them. Like it's a pretty miserable way of looking at it. But the more of these sort of pieces you write, the more similarities you see, and so you sort of know what to look for and the touch points to go for. And I think, unfortunately, West Ham are now just a classic case of a club, like an absolutely directionless club, and that is saying the piece is really dangerous. I think that's sort of like, what is the point of West Ham? It's not saying like it's a pointless club, because it isn't. There's so many wonderful things attached to West Ham. There's an incredible fan base. There's a lot of great players. I happen to like Graham Potter as a manager generally, but I think he's not doing well at West Ham. But it's what are West Ham aiming for here? Because they're pretty unique. Like there's no other club I can really see that isn't really aspiring for Europe, but also doesn't feel hugely threatened by relegation until sort of 2 weeks ago.
One line in the piece you wrote, George, was David Sullivan tends to avoid consequences. The only consequence, he gets loads of ire from the fans, right? He gets grief like that all of the time, but ultimately the amount of interest in loan interest that he's taken out of the club stretches into the tens of millions of pounds since he's been there. I mean, these are just sort of observable figures that you can find in the annual company returns. Same when David Gold was alive as well. He's running it like a business, right? Where he's trying to the sole purpose is to just exist, and I think that's where so much of the animosity has come between Sullivan and fans in the past, and does between owners and football fans generally, right? Is that striking the balance between running a sustainable business and staying true to what a football club is in its nature, in that it's an emotional entity that people give their whole lives about. People don't care whether their local butcher goes bust, really, do they? Or businesses. They don't care about businesses in the same way. There's obviously a balance to sort of strike there. Do you sort of have any sympathy at all?
Do I have any sympathy at all with David Sullivan? No, not really. I think he's had.
That isn't me saying I do, by the way, before anyone gets on.
I think he's had. Any sort of personal issues with him aside, I think he's had every opportunity to turn the club into, or to make more of the club than he has. He has made some relatively sensible financial decisions, but nothing that no half decent businessman could have made. And I think alongside that, you say he's run it like a business, but there's also a lot of elements of the club that seems he hasn't really been running like a business.
How so?
All just incredibly. A very small group of people with all the power, and only listening to those people, and only really relying on the same few group of agents, family members, friends, and just believing that will help get him through. And that's not how you run a modern football club or a modern business.
Well, I mean, Will Salthouse, the agent, is the one that gets the most sort of ire from West Ham fans. I believe Callum Wilson is the latest player that West Ham have signed. West Ham fans not overly enthused about him, although performed very well against Nottingham Forest. I feel that David Sullivan and obviously David Gold, when he was around, almost cast the rod for their own back by moving to the London Stadium, right? Cara Brady, who's said it on the record before, says that it's her proudest achievement in football, in her time at West Ham, moving the club from Upton Park to London Stadium. For people like me who had a season ticket at Upton Park, I was 9 years of age, that's sort of a bit of a dagger in the heart to hear. But from a revenue perspective, you can, and for lots of other reasons, you can understand it. Personally, I I've never enjoyed football less than watching it at London Stadium. I'd go back to Upton Park in a heartbeat if there weren't all those ghastly flats there now. But what I find that the move when you say about West Ham being a pointless club, there's so many fans of other teams who phone into radio shows and who you talk to out and about in the pubs, and you're like, you're West Ham, why are you bothered? You've always just come 12th or 13th, or a bit yo-yoed a couple of times. You go down, you'll be at the bottom half. You've never been that much of a big deal. What's the point? Well, I think the difference is at Upton Park, there were other positive things about being a West Ham fan. You could go and you were going to football and a football stadium that had the character was oozing out of it, albeit that, the East Ham was falling down, and it wasn't this Tottenham Hotspur-esque, sort of glossy, wonderful place to play football. But you were watching football on the same patch of grass that Bobby Moore had played football, and that Jeff Hurst had played football, and that Frank Lampard and Tony Cottee and Frank McAvenny and the endless ream of legendary players. You were going and you were hearing stories from your nans and your granddads and your dads and all that about that days they'd had walking up Green Street and where they'd been sitting in the same seats. It was all those sort of intangible things that you can't find in any balance sheet or any, corporate hospitality here, and also like community outreach, PR releases that clubs do. None of that stuff, the stuff that actually matters to a football team. So much of that was lost. Now at London Stadium, if the football's not good, then there's nothing else. There's nothing else to be positive about. Who wants to go to walk through Westfield? There's no history there. There's no, I don't need both of my hands to count the iconic West Ham players who've played on the pitch at London Stadium. There's nothing else anymore. There's none of that intangible stuff. And strangely, I feel that they've made a sort of rod for their own back with that. When you said that line about consequences, what were you thinking? What consequences were you thinking of that Sullivan avoids, you think?
I mean, it's always difficult talking about chairman of clubs because, the line about Daniel Levy was always, you can say what you want, but he's never going to leave, and he left yesterday. It's that you complain all you want, but they're never going to leave. They're never going to sack themselves. But that is the consequence, or maybe the consequence. The fair consequence for some of how he's run the club would be relegation. And I'm not saying that would be a good thing, because it wouldn't at all.
Lots of fans will say that.
But it would potentially be the deserved consequence for how he's run the club, because West Ham now have a huge revenue and they are a very big financial club. But he has made an incredible number of poor decisions in terms of signings in particular, certainly sanctioned an incredible number of poor decisions, whether that's signings or whether that's anything and everything that happened under Tim Syton now for a number of years. You talk about not having history in the London Stadium. Are you not a big Greg Rutherford fan?
My granddad didn't talk about him quite as fondly as he did about watching Bobby Moore, but I sort of know what you mean. But you brought up the stat. I think it was you that brought it into people's attention. At Upton Park, West Ham conceded 5 or more goals just once in the 21st century, whereas they've done it 8 in 9 years at the London Stadium. Obviously, an element of context there in the gulf between huge team or the mega rich teams and the quality and the sort of lesser teams, I suppose. West Ham fans will say that when they say, there's no coherent plan. I find it impossible to believe that a man that intelligent, right? The man's a multi-billionaire in his own right. That impossible to believe that he just turns up to work every day just thinking, this is going to get us into Europe. Do you agree, first of all, that the plan that isn't that there's a lack of plan, but that the plan is just to exist in the Premier League?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it, and I think the plan can still be based on the wrong information, maybe. I think there's a sort of wider belief in football and more generally that West Ham are behind on data analytics and how they've adopted that. I think last week I sort of compared them slightly to Man United and the issues they've had. Just for a very long time, the issue has been that they've failed to adequately modernise, and I think that is still an issue. And so I think, that's definitely a big problem.
Yeah, Carl McCauley's obviously come as our head of recruitment to replace Tim Stein with a watered down job title, so not as much clout as Tim Stein had before. That was widely considered a disaster, the Stein era. But like you say, it's all very well bringing in McCauley, but what tools has he got at his disposal? You know, you can bring Lewis Hamilton along, but if you put him in my 20-year-old Audi, he's not going to go as fast as he can in a Ferrari. What do you make of the fan advisory board's stance recently? The very public letter that they sent out, a vote of no confidence in the board. You touched on it there about you can say that. You can say that these people just aren't going to leave. My stance on it, perhaps it's a bit of a sort of bleak one, is that, you know, when you compare the pull of, I don't think you can compare, you know, fans' ire, given what David Sullivan rode out last time with the protest on the pitch and the corner flag, the famous picture of the corner flag in the centre circle in that game against Burnley. Dark days for West Ham, tens of thousands of fans marching through the streets of Stratford in protest. He rode that out. I think fans often overlook the pull on the other side. So it's all of like fans protest and almost expect they're just going to go, yeah, fair enough, then I'll sell up. When obviously the huge financial rewards that come with owning a Premier League club, and just on a human level, what else would he do? I think he feels like it's his purpose. And he's obviously getting on now, well into his 70s. That is his reason to get up every day. And I don't. And Karen Brady was on TalkSport 2 or 3 weeks ago on Sean Custis and Henry Winter's show on Sunday morning and said there's no intention. They're not going anywhere. Vanessa Gold is trying to sell the shares that obviously came from David when he died. But other than that, there's no intention of the board going anywhere. Do you feel these the movements from the fan advisory board? I think it's Hammers United as well, who are part of that wider group, are suggesting fans boycott the game at home to Brentford. What's your stance on movements such as those?
Yeah, well, I think just to start with, the fact it's happening shows how deep and widespread the feeling is. I mean, you talked earlier, when you were talking earlier, you said the sort of two main feelings in the fan base are anger and apathy. And anger is so much better than apathy in this situation. If everyone's apathetic, you lost it. You're fucked. Sorry, I don't know if I can say that. But
no, you're fine. Yeah. Kind of the same in society, right?
Yeah. Football clubs, I mean, fundamentally run on hope. People come every week basically because of hope. And if you lose that, there's really nothing left. And if people are angry, that still shows that they believe that this football club can be better and believe that there can be change, whether that's with or without Sullivan. And so ultimately, I think it's definitely a good thing, and I would hugely encourage it.
Yeah, I think. Do you think it can have an impact? What impact do you think it could have? Because the Daniel Levy thing you mentioned earlier on, such a great question, and he gets so much grief. Can you imagine? Tottenham were no bigger or better than we were for most of the 90s, right? A little bit, a tinge more history, you know, but there wasn't a lot in it. Look what he's turned them into now, and what Tottenham Hotspur are in Europe, 18 of the last 21 years or something crazy like that. The stadium far more suited to, whether or not it's better than White Hart Lane depends kind of on what metrics you use to decide whether you enjoy football, right? But the stadium, just compared to the London Stadium, worlds apart. And he still gets a load of grief, right? So do you sort of, what impact do you think such things can have when weighed against, you know, all of the other things, the huge financial sort of improvements and just general status and all the other things that will be keeping David Sullivan in situ?
Yeah, well, I think there's been evidence before that Sullivan, maybe too reactively, has listened to fan complaints, and so that's,
I couldn't agree more. Yes,
that's certainly worth taking into account. I don't think he's just going to walk away, but it's like this sort of thing in particular, when it's organised, when fans are have very specific demands that are being laid out in a sort of easily comprehensible and cohesive way. I think that's the best way of going about something like this, because you can. He's not going to look at them and go, "Oh yeah, these are all great ideas," but some of it might start to break through. There'll be a lot of people at the club that will have to read this and will have to look at it in great detail, because that will be their jobs. And there will be parts of it that they might go, you know what, we're going to start changing that. So even if it just, all it really helps implement is maybe a few small changes that just maybe bring through another few small changes in the future and just make everything just a bit better, that can only be a good thing.
I think most West Ham fans would suggest now that these little things probably aren't really what's needed to make it different. Do you think David Sullivan's going anywhere, George?
No, probably not. You get a sense if he was going to have just walked away, he would have walked away already. He's already quite an old man. He doesn't seem to have much interest in that. He's watched his business partner and co-owner die and has decided he still wants to do it. So no, I don't think he's going to, unless or until he's forced to. I don't think he will go anywhere out of choice.
I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, just as a bit of a vanity project for me, right? on the David Moyes point. Now, I did a podcast off the back of your article actually the other day, because I do get a lot of grief, and it's just a bit of fun, really. Now, the stage it's got to among the listeners. My favourite comment after last week's podcast, when I suggested the only reason we won at Nottingham Forest was because Graham Potter played Moyes ball, was Clown Prince Pugh strikes again. This man will never be happy with anything other than return of David Moyes. Actually, I'd be happy with anything that even remotely resembled the success West Ham achieved under David Moyes. If it happened to come from us having a bit more possession, so everyone else was happy days. Now, I'll just read a bit of your piece out if you don't mind. Some suggest the current fiasco is the inevitable consequence of wanting more, of sacking David Moyes, of aiming higher and higher when you've already peaked. Yet that simply isn't true. When some suggest, I am one of those people who suggest that. And the thing I came out after on the podcast and clarified with everyone was actually that, because, and maybe I am guilty of the apathy having sort of crept in a bit. Well, I definitely am. I can tell you that. My sort of view on it, and my sort of pro-Moyes stance so much, and why I thought it was such a disaster getting rid of him, was because I think that, from what you said in your piece and what lots of West Ham fans think, regardless of their sort of persuasion, if there's a general acceptance that the quality of ownership and that the quality of the manner in which West Ham United is run isn't brilliant, I'm like, exactly. And we finally stumbled across someone who can sort of make sense of all of the madness and make all of the random pieces. He can manage upwards. He can manage the enormous, often split, but loud, passionate, aggressive fan base, of which I've been one of my entire life. He somehow got the players to play and managed all the underfunding of the transfer market, all of the things that fans often rightly moan about West Ham United, the madness of a club that it is. He somehow, through some alchemy, brought everything together. All right, one of the symptoms of that was a little bit more of a pragmatic style of football, but we actually had some games we could remember, and we beat some teams, and we had European semi-finals and quarter-finals and finals, and we lifted a trophy above our heads, all of those things. Why on earth, if everyone also accepts that David Sullivan isn't going anywhere, why wouldn't you want the bloke who, the only person who's proved they can make a success of it on a sustained period under David Sullivan, why wouldn't you want him sticking around? So yeah, for purely vanity purposes, what do you make of that?
I covered a bit of the end of the Moyes regime, and I will say it was really quite miserable.
That was the worst bit, George. You should have been.
It was, absolutely. I completely understand that. But I completely agree. What Moyes did was incredibly rare, and is being proved with every new manager that comes in how rare a skill it was. I don't think he's necessarily unique in being able to do that. And I think there is a sort of element of, I think when we talk about sort of Sullivan having a coherent plan, hiring Moyes is one of the best decisions he ever made, and he probably just made it out of luck, basically.
I
and
happen to
he made
agree
it in
with you.
spite of himself. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think Moyes is clearly a brilliant manager, and West Ham are going to need a Moyes or a Moyes equivalent to dig themselves out of whatever hole it is, because I'm not sure Graham Potter's going to do it. However good the Forest win was, and I completely get that. I think the stat from last
Paper and
season.
cracks.
Yeah, I think the stat from last season was that Potter averaged, was it 1 point a game in the Premier League, and through the first three games of this season, he has 3 points. That will get you 38 points this season, which probably won't get you relegated, but it won't do much else. And so, whereas Moyes did do more than that, which shows that there is capacity within the squad and within this club to do more. But the issue is not with trying to, as I say in the piece, the issue isn't with wanting more or trying to climb higher up the table. It's with making really poor decisions to get there.
If you don't think not Graham Potter, I happen to agree with you. I don't think Graham Potter's got the necessary skill it takes to sort of produce anything even faintly resembling what we had during those glory years. I don't think he's got it in him either. You say David Moyes isn't unique in that. I'm so desperate for you to be right, because I'm so bored of getting grief off of everyone all the time for daring to say that David Moyes was a good manager. Who do you think is one of those people? I said, for almost the same sort of reasons, I think it would be wonderful to have Jose Mourinho at the club, however corrosive he may be for the mid to long term sort of prospects, but it can't be any worse or crap or apathetic and naff than it is now, can it?
Yeah, Jose definitely doesn't do apathy. I think he would. I think it would be fascinating to watch as an outsider. I'm not sure how much you'd enjoy it after about 6 months as a fan.
Who else do you think then? Seriously,
late era Jose. That is a horrendously difficult answer that I should have prepared for, and I haven't. I don't just want to say Sean Dyche, which is
but the fans wouldn't. That's my point.
Yeah.
The fans would not accept him. That's my point. Is that if those people were so unhappy with David Moyes, and all right, the football wasn't great, but we're actually at least high up in the top half of the table in Europe, they won't accept another manager like that again. That's why it's this just this impossible formula to, because you say, oh, David Moyes isn't unique in it. You go, all right, who is then? No one's really got an answer for that. Yeah. The club isn't set up well enough, as we've established, for a manager who plays in the Graham Potter, the Pep Guardiola, the Andoni Iraola style. Our fan base, they're not as patient and calm and relaxed as Brighton and Brentford fans and all that. And we'll just be able to go down a pub and be pleased that their data systems and analytics and general recruitment department is world leading. West Ham fans don't want that. They want everything. Yeah. They want you know what I mean? They want it on the pitch. They want beautiful football, and they want progress up the leagues, all that sort of stuff. I don't think there is an answer. Look, George, I'm going to let you go. The last line in your piece: Leicester were relegated 3 seasons ago by the belief they were too big to fail. Apathy devours everything it touches. The mid-table football club's plague, and it could already be too late. Do you still, obviously with the glorious win at Nottingham Forest since then, do you still think there's a chance West Ham go down?
It's definitely not impossible. No? Definitely not impossible. I think it would be one of the worst relegations I can remember in Premier League history, based on the revenue of the club, the size of the squad. But even after a couple of seemingly half-decent signings on deadline day, it is still a botched squad at best. You struggle to trust the goalkeepers, even bringing in Igor Julio as a centre-back. Still a very touch-and-go group of centre-backs. Nicholas Füllkrug, I happen to be quite fond of from his time in Germany.
Me too,
but is an odd choice to lead the line, given the rest of that squad. Paqueta looking good is a good thing, but there's just so many question marks and so many bits of a squad that don't seem to fit together that I just struggle to trust that too much good is going to come out of it in a hurry.
Just last one then, George, just on David Sullivan, the board generally, sort of general thoughts or anything that we sort of maybe haven't covered, or any sort of thoughts and feelings you've got. Just one to leave all the West Ham fans with. We'll be delighted to have heard you speak on this matter in person after your brilliant piece that was received so well.
If it's a message for West Ham fans, I think I'll just repeat what I said earlier. Being angry is a great thing, and trying to fight against an ownership that have now increasingly run a club badly for a number of years can only be a good thing, and keep doing it.
Brilliant. George Sims from The Observer there. Look, thanks very much for watching and for listening, everyone. Hope this was a bit of nice international break listening for you. Absolutely great to get George on. We'll try and do that again as the season rumbles on. Some excellent insight and a couple of decent pieces on George's Twitter since as well, if you like the tone of the one he wrote about West Ham and just the sort of general degradation of the football fan experience these days. George, thanks very much for coming on. Thanks very much for watching and listening, everyone. Follow us on socials at @WeAre_West Ham on Twitter, We Are West Ham Pod on Instagram. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. And don't forget, if you want all of your podcasts a day before everyone else and ad-free listening, get us on patreon.com/We Are West Ham Podcast for less than £4 a month. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll speak to you after the break.